The Veyron scout ship had been drifting at the edge of the solar system for 6 hours before Rael finally said anything worth recording. He was looking at the planet through the viewport. It was blue and white, wrapped in slow clouds, hanging in the dark like something that did not belong there. Not because it was ugly, because it was alive in a way that made the instruments nervous. The instruments were never nervous. Dura looked up from her workstation. She had been running the first passive scans for the last 2 hours. The data was still coming in, sorting itself into categories the Veyron system understood: atmosphere, population density, energy output, industrial signatures, the usual columns. "It reads as mid-level," she said. "Political structure is fragmented. No faster-than-light signature. No space-based weapons platforms detected. Energy output is high for the developmental stage but not unusual." Rael did not turn from the viewport. "What is the population count?" 8 billion approximately. He was quiet for a moment. 8 billion was not unusual either. The Veyron collective had absorbed species with larger populations. It had absorbed species with smaller ones. The size of a civilization did not determine how difficult it was to bring into the fold. Temperament did. Organization did. Willingness to understand the offer being made to them did. He turned from the viewport and walked to his own workstation. The scout ship was small. 3 crew stations on the lower deck, Soth's command position on the upper deck, a narrow corridor connecting them, and a data room at the back that hummed constantly. The ship was built for observation, not comfort. The Veyrons had never needed comfort to do their work well. "Run the broadcast intercepts," Rael said. "I want to start understanding how they communicate before we move any closer." Dura pulled up the intercept queue. The translation algorithm was already working, pulling signal from hundreds of overlapping broadcast sources: radio, digital, encrypted, open. The planet talked constantly. That was not unusual either. Most civilizations at this developmental stage communicated at high volume. It was a sign of social complexity, which was generally a positive indicator. She started reading out the first translated fragments: a weather report, a sports result, a financial index, a political speech, a dramatic fictional program about people arguing in a large building. Rael noted each one and categorized it. Then Dura stopped. She read something on her screen. She read it again. Then she pulled up the source file and read the full item. "Rael. Log it and move on." "Rael, this one is different." He looked over. Her expression was not alarmed exactly. It was the particular look she got when data did not match any existing model in her training. He had seen it twice in 4 years of working together. Once on the ice planet survey. Once during the gas giant mapping when the readings suggested something impossible and turned out to be correct. He walked to her station. The translated item on her screen was a news broadcast summary. The headline read, "Third field test of the new ground-penetrating artillery system confirmed successful. Payload delivery accurate to within 2 meters at a range of 40 kilometers. Defense Ministry confirms production contract for 300 units." Below it was a follow-up item. A separate government had announced a counter-procurement agreement with a different supplier for a similar system. The report estimated 600 units over 2 years. Below that was another item. An international monitoring body had expressed concern about the escalation. The concern had been noted and filed. The procurement continued. Rael straightened up. He did not say anything for a moment. He was thinking, which he did quietly and thoroughly. The data point on its own was not unusual. Conflict-prone species existed. The Veyron collective had encountered them. Several had even been successfully integrated, though the process had required patience. What made him pause was the secondary layer, the monitoring body, the counter-procurement, the scale of the numbers, the speed of the response. This was not a civilization reacting to conflict. This was a civilization that had built conflict management into its infrastructure, the way other species built roads. He walked back to his station and opened a new report file. "I am filing a recommendation for an extended observation period," he said. "Before any contact decision is made, I want a full review of their broadcast archive, historical records if we can access them, industrial output data, resource allocation patterns." Dura was still looking at her screen. "How long of an extension?" "As long as it takes." Commander Soth's voice came through the intercom from the upper deck. It was short, as his communications usually were. "What is the delay, Rail?" "No delay, Commander. I am requesting additional observation time before we approach. The initial data suggests this one warrants care." A pause. Soth did not like delays. He liked schedules and outcomes, but he was not reckless. He had not reached his rank by ignoring his scout's instincts. "2 weeks," Soth said, "then we assess." Rail confirmed it and closed the channel. He looked back at the planet on the viewport screen. The clouds moved slowly across the surface. From this distance it looked peaceful. From this distance everything did. Dura was already pulling the next batch of broadcast intercepts into the translation queue. The algorithm churned through them steadily, item after item. The planet kept talking, the way it apparently always did, about 1,000 different things at once. Rail started reading. By the 3rd hour, he had stopped counting how many of the items flagged a weapons reference. He had started counting the ones that did not. There were fewer of those. He made a note, then he kept reading. The first thing Dale Hurst did every morning was check the perimeter. Not because anything had ever come through it, not because he expected something would. It was simply a habit from 30 years of being in places where checking the perimeter was the difference between knowing and not knowing had consequences. The habit had outlasted the job. Most of the important ones did. He walked the fence line of his property while the sky was still gray. His 2 dogs moved with him, one on each side, reading the grass and the air. Dale read the fence posts and the gate hinges and the lock on the barn. He did this without thinking about it, the way a person breathes, and by the time he reached the far corner of the east field, the sun was beginning to show itself above the mountains and the day had officially started. He had no idea he was being watched. Rail had positioned the cloaked observation craft above the tree line on the northern edge of the property 2 days ago. He and Dura had been running shifts, 6 hours on and 6 hours off, building a profile of the subject. Dale Hurst, age 58, retired from military service after 3 decades, now operating a mixed livestock and crop farm in rural Montana. No criminal record, no current affiliation with any government body. 1 spouse, 2 dogs, 1 truck, 1 barn. The barn was what Rail kept returning to. It was a large structure, weathered gray wood, 3 sets of wide doors, a hayloft above the main floor. By any agricultural standard it was unremarkable. But over 2 days of observation, Rail had cataloged what came in and out of it, and the catalog was giving him the same quiet unease that the broadcast data had given him 2 weeks ago. Fertilizer chemicals in a locked cabinet on the east wall. The quantities were appropriate for the farm size, and nothing the Veyron database would flag individually. Together, in sufficient concentration and combination, the database flagged them at a medium threat indicator. Dale used them carefully and properly. He had no interest in making anything explode. But the knowledge of what they were, sitting inside a barn alongside heavy metal tools and compressed fuel canisters, and a collection of wire strong enough to hold a large animal, sat in Rail's data log like a question he could not quite finish asking. Then there was the rifle. Dale took it down from its place on the barn wall at mid-morning to check the mechanism. He did this the way he checked the fence, without drama, without ceremony, with complete focused calm. He ran a cloth along the barrel. He checked the action. He looked down the sights once. He hung it back on the wall. The whole process took 4 minutes. Dura had been watching over Rael's shoulder. She was quiet for a long time after Dale walked back out of the barn. Then she said, "He does not look afraid of it." "No," Rael said, "he does not. Most beings are afraid of things that can kill them. Most beings have not spent 30 years working with things that can kill them." Rael made a note in the profile file. He has made a kind of peace with it, the object and the danger and the responsibility. He holds all three at once, and they do not seem to weigh on him. Dura considered this. Is that impressive or alarming? I have not decided yet. The afternoon brought something new. A vehicle came down the road at the standard time Rael had noted as Rita Hurst's return pattern. She parked beside the farmhouse, gathered papers from the seat beside her, and walked to where Dale was sitting on the porch. She taught at a small school 40 minutes away. The papers were lesson materials. Rael had the audio intercept running at full resolution. The translation came through clean. She was preparing a science lesson. The subject was chemical reactions. She walked Dale through the structure of it while he listened. Basic combustion principles, acid and base behavior, a demonstration using materials available in a standard household. She had designed it so a 12-year-old could follow it and find it interesting. Dura's hand stopped moving over her workstation. "The children learn this," she said. "It is a standard educational sequence for this developmental stage," Rael said, though he was not reading from anything. He was watching Dale nod along to Rita's explanation and suggest she simplify one section. Rael, the combustion section, the ratios she is using as an example, if you scaled those up. "I know. She is teaching children." "I know, Dura." They sat in silence. On the porch below, Dale poured Rita a cup of something hot from a metal container. One of the dogs put its head on Dale's knee. The sun was going down over the mountains, and the light across the fields had turned the color of old copper. It was a peaceful scene. It was one of the most peaceful scenes Rael had observed in 14 years of field work. He opened a new report and marked it urgent. He sent it to Commander Soth with a single added note at the bottom that he did not usually include in field reports. The note said, "I think we may have significantly misjudged what we are looking at." The lights came on inside the farmhouse. The dogs came inside. Dale and Rita moved around in the warm yellow glow of their windows, and Rael watched until the last light in the house went out, and then he kept watching the dark farm for a long time after, thinking. Commander Soth had a habit of standing when he did not like what he was hearing. He had been standing for 40 minutes. Rael was presenting the findings from 3 weeks of data analysis, not just the farm observations, everything, the full industrial and scientific picture of the planet below. He had organized it into categories. He presented them one at a time. Soth stood at the back of the lower deck with his arms behind his back and his expression getting steadily harder with each new category. Steel production was first. The humans produced steel at a volume that had no equivalent in the Veyron database outside of civilizations currently engaged in large-scale armed conflict. The planet was not currently engaged in large-scale armed conflict. It was producing that tonnage during what the humans themselves referred to as a period of relative peace. The steel went into buildings and vehicles and infrastructure. It also went, in documented quantities, into weapon systems. Dura pulled up the next file without being asked. She had learned the rhythm of these briefings. Fertilizer came second. Global production of nitrogen-based agricultural compounds was enough to feed the planet and leave a substantial surplus. The surplus was agricultural in intent. In composition, it was indistinguishable, at scale, from industrial explosive precursor material. The humans knew this. There were international treaties attempting to regulate portions of it. The treaties covered approximately 40% of global production. Soth had not moved. Medical research was third. Rail walked through this one carefully because it was the one that had surprised him most. The human medical database was the most detailed biological vulnerability study he had encountered in any species. Centuries of accumulated knowledge about exactly how an organic body fails, which systems collapse first, which interventions could reverse failure and which could accelerate it. All of it documented, cross-referenced, and openly published in scientific journals accessible to anyone with a network connection. The intent was healing. The dual application potential was something Rail left as a statistical output rather than a verbal statement. The numbers were sufficient. Soth said his first words in 40 minutes. This is public information. Most of it, Rail confirmed. Freely available, a student could access it. More silence. Transportation and fuel infrastructure was fourth. The human logistics network was capable of moving millions of personnel and millions of tons of material across the full breadth of the continent in under a week using existing civilian infrastructure alone. The military component was additional to that. Rail showed the mapping overlays, the road density, the rail coverage, the fuel depot distribution, the port capacity on every major coastline. He did not add commentary. The map was commentary enough. Then he put a Nair's research file on the main screen. She had a biography attached to her academic profile. Rail read the relevant parts aloud. 43 years old, materials scientist at a research university. 14 published papers on composite material stress tolerances, thermal resistance, and structural behavior under high-velocity pressure. Her current project involved developing lighter and stronger materials for civilian aircraft fuselage design. She had received a grant from an aeronautical engineering foundation. She was, by all available evidence, trying to make air travel safer and more fuel-efficient. Rail pulled up the weapons analysis output. The Veyron system had taken her published material specifications and run a separate calculation. The same compounds, the same density ratios, the same layering architecture she had designed for aircraft panels, shaped into a different geometry, produced a projectile casing with impact characteristics outside anything in the Veyron combat database. Not marginally outside, significantly outside. Nair did not know this. She had never thought about it. She was building lighter planes. Soth sat down. That was unusual enough that Dura glanced at Rail, who kept his expression neutral. She is not a weapons designer, Soth said. No. She has no military affiliation. None recorded. And yet her published civilian research produces this output. The analysis ran 3 times, Rail said. The result was the same each time. Soth looked at the screen for a long moment. He had been in the Veyron military for 31 years. He had overseen the annexation of 6 species. He had never raised a weapon in combat because it had never been necessary. The Veyron approach was always the same. Arrive, demonstrate capability, present terms, allow the subject civilization to make the reasonable choice. No species had ever declined. The approach worked because the capability demonstration was always sufficient. If we presented a capability demonstration to these humans, Soth said slowly, as though working something out, and they did not accept the terms. He did not finish the sentence. I have a preliminary resistance scenario model, Rail said. You do not have to ask the analyst to run it. I can show you the output directly. Soth looked at him. Show me. Rail pulled up the model. He let Soth read it. He watched the commander's face while he read it. He did not enjoy watching that process, but he did not look away either. Soth needed to see it clearly and completely, and Rail needed to know that he had. When Soth finished reading, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Get me a channel to High Chancellor Oren." Rail opened the channel without a word. Outside the viewport, the planet turned slowly in the dark, blue and white and entirely unaware, carrying its 8 billion lives and its centuries of accumulated dangerous knowledge through the silence of space, as it had always done, going nowhere in particular, simply persisting. The way it always had. Rael found the peace treaties first. There were thousands of them, spanning centuries. Some were between two nations, some involved dozens. Some were written on paper and signed in grand buildings with witnesses and ceremony. Some were agreed through intermediaries and never formally recorded at all. He found peace treaties covering land, water, airspace, trade routes, weapons types, prisoner treatment, civilian protection, cultural property, and the rights of people who had nothing to do with any conflict, but found themselves inside one anyway. He had requested the historical archive access from Soth the previous evening. Soth had approved it without discussion, which meant Soth was thinking along the same lines Rael was and wanted the information as much as Rael did, possibly more. So Rael sat alone in the data room in the ship's artificial night and read. He had expected to find a war species. The weapons data had pointed clearly in that direction. A civilization that embedded weapons knowledge into civilian education, that produced steel and explosive precursors at military-grade volumes during peacetime, that had one of its academic researchers inadvertently designing advanced projectile materials while trying to build aircraft. He had expected to find a species that liked fighting. Instead, he found a species that had been desperately trying to stop. The peace treaties were not the only evidence. There were international humanitarian organizations with global reach, funded by voluntary contributions, staffed by people who had chosen to spend their lives alleviating the consequences of conflicts they had not started. There were legal frameworks built over generations specifically to define what was and was not acceptable to do to another person during a war, which meant the humans had sat down and tried to write rules for something they wished did not exist. There were protest movements, enormous ones, photographs of hundreds of thousands of people in city streets demanding that their governments put the weapons down. Sometimes it had worked, sometimes it had not. Rael followed one particular thread for 2 hours. A group of nations had gathered after one of the largest conflicts in human history and built an international body specifically designed to prevent another one. The humans had called it an unprecedented step toward permanent peace. They had believed in it. He could read that in the speeches and the documents, the genuine weight of hope that this structure, this agreement, this framework of shared accountability would finally hold. Then he read what happened over the next 50 years. He did not find cynicism in himself looking at that record. He found something closer to grief, which was not an emotion he associated with field work. The humans had tried. They had kept trying even after the international body had failed to prevent new conflicts. They had reformed it, argued about it, funded it inadequately, blamed each other for its failures, and then showed up to the next session anyway. They had never stopped trying. They had also never stopped building weapons. Not because they wanted to use them. The record was clear on that. The political leaders who authorized weapons programs were the same leaders attending peace summits the following week. The defense ministers who signed procurement contracts had children. They took holidays. They worried about the future the same way everyone worried about the future. They were not warmongering. They were afraid. And the fear was reasonable. Because every time one group of humans had put their weapons down unilaterally, believing that safety lay in the gesture, someone else had picked up weapons and used that moment. The historical record showed this pattern with a repetition that made Rael feel a cold clarity he had not expected. The humans were not dangerous because they were violent by nature. They were dangerous because they had learned, repeatedly and at enormous cost, that being unarmed in a world that was not fully disarmed meant being vulnerable to anyone who chose to take advantage of that. The weapons were not aggression, they were memory. Rael wrote this in his log. Then he sat back and looked at the ceiling of the data room and thought about the Veyron Collective and its 3,000 years of peace. The Veyron Collective had never fought a war. It had never had to. It had arrived at sufficient technological and organizational capability before any rival emerged to challenge it. Its peace was real, but it was also, Rail now recognized, a kind of luck. The humans had not been lucky. They had developed at the same time as each other in fragments on the same planet, competing for resources and survival from the very beginning. Every step they had taken toward cooperation had been taken against the background noise of knowing that not everyone would cooperate. And they had kept taking those steps anyway. He spent another hour on this, reading about international aid networks, scientific collaboration between nations that were simultaneously pointing missiles at each other, musicians and artists who crossed borders that soldiers were guarding with guns, a human doctor who had treated wounded people from 3 different sides of a conflict, keeping records of all of them, because that was what doctors did. By the time the ship's artificial dawn cycle began, Rail had his answer. He went to find Soth. Soth was at his station with his own data feed open, which meant he had been awake through the artificial night as well, reading something. He looked up when Rail came in. "They are not a war species," Rail said. "They are a species that has been at war with itself for most of its history and has been trying to stop the entire time." Soth looked at him steadily. "That is a meaningful distinction." "Yes, it is the most meaningful one we have found." Soth was quiet for a moment. Then he reached over and opened the channel to High Chancellor Oren. "We need a different conversation than the one we planned," Soth said into the channel. From the transmission screen, Oren's white-marked face regarded them both with the careful patience of someone who had been expecting this call. "Tell me," Oren said. Dale Hurst noticed them when they were still 200 meters away. He did not reach for anything. He did not move quickly. He set his coffee down on the porch rail with the care of someone making sure it would not tip over, and then he stood up straight and watched them come across the field. They were not human. That was clear at the distance. The height was wrong. The way they moved was wrong. The color of them in the late afternoon light was wrong in a way he could not quite name but could not mistake. His brain tried several categories and discarded all of them. It settled on simply watching and waiting for more information, which was what his brain had been trained to do in situations where existing categories were not sufficient. Rail and Dura stopped at the base of the porch steps. Dale looked at them. They looked at him. "Do you want to sit down?" Dale said. Rail had prepared for many possible first responses from the human subject. Aggression was on the list. Paralysis was on the list. Retreat was on the list. Theological crisis was on the list, based on the human broadcast data about belief systems and their relationship to the concept of life beyond their planet. He had not prepared for an immediate invitation to sit. They sat on the porch, Rail and Dura on the bench, Dale in his chair. The coffee was still on the rail and he picked it up and held it in both hands the way a person holds something familiar when everything else is unfamiliar. The conversation began with practical things, where Rail and Dura came from, what they were doing here. Dale asked questions that were direct and concrete. He did not ask them if they came in peace. He asked how long they had been observing, how many of them were here, and whether the people in whatever government handled this sort of thing had been notified. Rail told him they had not. He told Dale he was the first human contact, chosen because his profile suggested he was capable of receiving information without immediate destabilization. Dale made a short sound that might have been a laugh. "That is a careful way of saying you thought I would not panic," Dale said. "Yes," Rail said. "I was in the military for 30 years. I have seen things that would panic most people. You get used to recalibrating your sense of normal." He looked at them steadily. "I will not say this is normal, but I can work with it." Dura had been quiet since they sat down. She had been watching Dale the way she watched everything, with open attention, taking it in. Now she said, "We watched you for several weeks. We saw you clean the weapon in your barn." Dale nodded once. "The rifle." "You did it without any emotional response. It was like watching someone maintain a tool." That is what it is. But it is not only a tool. Dale was quiet for a moment. He looked out at the field. The evening light was pulling long shadows from the fence posts. One of the dogs had come out and was lying near his feet. No, he said, it is not only a tool, it is a tool that can end someone's life. I have always known that. I knew it when I was first trained and I know it now. He looked back at them. What you are really asking is why I keep it. Yes, Dura said. Because there are things on this planet that could come through that barn door and hurt what I care about, and I am not willing to be unable to respond to that. The rifle has nothing to do with wanting to hurt anything. It has everything to do with not being helpless. He paused. I have been in places where people were helpless. I have seen what happens. I chose a long time ago that I would not be that, and I would not let the people near me be that if I could do anything about it. Rail recorded this and transmitted the audio directly to High Chancellor Oren without summarizing it. Dura asked about the war, not a specific one, just the concept, whether Dale had understood while he was in it what it was doing. Dale thought about this for a while before answering. You understand it while you are in it, he said. You understand it in pieces in the moments. You do not understand the whole shape of it until later, sometimes much later, and once you see the whole shape of it you spend a long time wishing you could go back and stop it at the beginning. He was quiet. But you cannot stop something that started before you were born. You can only deal with what is in front of you, and hope that what you do makes it slightly less likely to happen to the people who come after you. Neither Rail nor Dura said anything. I think, Dale said, that is why humans keep building things that can cause harm even when they do not want to cause harm, because we have never been in a position where we could afford to stop completely. Not all at once, not unilaterally, because the last 10 times someone did that unilaterally, it went badly for them. Rail thought about the peace treaties, about the pattern he had read in the historical data, about the international body built after the Great Conflict, staffed by people who believed in it, watching it be unable to prevent the next one. The door opened, and Rita came out with a tray. She had not been visible, but she had clearly known something was happening. She set the tray down on the rail, food and hot drinks. She looked at Rail and Dura with the particular attention of someone who processed unusual information by getting very calm. Where are you from? She asked. Rail explained. Rita listened. She nodded the way Dale had nodded, which was not agreement exactly, but the physical sign of someone receiving information without flinching. Have your people ever been through anything like what we have been through? She said. No, Rail said. She picked up her cup. She looked out at the mountains in the last of the light. I hope you never have to be, she said. They sat together on the porch until the stars came out. The Montana sky opened up above them, enormous and clear and full of light that had been traveling a long time to get there, and none of the four of them said very much, because there was not much left to say, and because the silence was doing something that words had not quite managed. It was doing something that felt, to Rail, like the beginning of understanding. High Chancellor Oren had listened to the recording from Dale's porch 4 times before the council session began. The chamber was large, 31 council seats arranged in a curved arc, each one occupied by a senior representative of the Veyron collective's governing structure. Rail appeared on the central transmission screen, relayed from the scout ship still in low Earth orbit. Dura sat beside him. Soth stood off to one side, arms behind his back, expression unreadable. Oren opened the session without ceremony. The debate that followed lasted most of the Veyron day cycle. The first position was the one Rail had expected. Councillor Marn, who oversaw expansion risk assessment, presented the case for quarantine. The planet was a productive and ongoing weapons development site at a civilizational scale. The species had no knowledge of the Veyron collective's existence and therefore no quarrel with it, but that situation was temporary. Expansion of the collective's boundaries would eventually bring them into contact regardless. Better to establish a controlled boundary now, place the system under long-range monitoring, and avoid the risk of an unpredictable and heavily armed civilization becoming aware of the collective on their own terms at an unpredictable time. The case was made carefully and without hostility. Marn was not wrong about the risk. Rael acknowledged that when it was his turn. The second position came from Counselor Fay, who handled diplomatic integration. She argued that the behavior record did not support the quarantine conclusion. The humans had developed significant weapons capability and had not used it to expand beyond their own planet. They had not launched attacks on neighboring systems because they did not know there were neighboring systems, but the absence of that knowledge was not what had kept them grounded. Their own internal political and ethical debates had kept them grounded. There were movements within human civilization specifically opposing the weaponization of space. There were legal frameworks under active development for it. A species that argued against its own expansion, that legislated its own restraint, was not a species seeking conquest. Marn responded that restraint without external accountability was temporary. Fay responded that the Veyron collective's own peace had never been tested by external threat, and therefore its accountability structures had never been proven either. The chamber was quiet for a moment after that. Orin called on Rael. Rael had prepared what he wanted to say. He had been preparing it since the night he spent in the data room reading peace treaties. He kept it short. He told the council that the Veyron collective had something that looked like wisdom, but might simply be the absence of difficulty. 3,000 years of peace was an extraordinary achievement. He did not diminish it, but it was also a peace that had never been threatened from outside, never tested by a rival that could match it, never required the collective to make the kind of choices humans had been making for all of recorded history. The humans had been making those choices in the hardest possible conditions, fragmented, competitive, often violent with each other. And in the middle of all of that, they had built hospitals, written music, established schools, developed ethical systems, and kept trying, generation after generation, to build something worth having. Not because it was easy, because they had decided it mattered even when everything around them argued against it. He said, a species that chooses to be better than its circumstances is not a threat. It is a model. He said, the weapons are not evidence that the humans are dangerous. The weapons are evidence that the humans have survived being in danger repeatedly without giving up on the possibility of something better. He said, if the Veyron collective was looking for an ally that understood peace as an active choice rather than a default condition, the humans were the only species it had ever encountered that qualified. The vote was not unanimous. 12 council members voted for quarantine. 19 voted for formal contact. Orin transmitted the result to the scout ship and authorized a diplomatic vessel to break orbit from the nearest Veyron way station and proceed to Earth. Soth looked at Rael after the channel closed. They will not react well to being told we have been watching them, Soth said. No, Rael agreed. They will not, but they would react worse to finding out later. General Bo Ren was in a secure facility on the eastern coast of North America when the transmission came through. The facility had been tracking the unidentified orbital object for 19 days. The object had done nothing aggressive. It had not responded to any signal. It had simply watched, and the watching had been noted, and preparations had been made quietly, without announcement, because the people in that facility understood that if something was watching you from orbit, the correct response was not panic but readiness. The transmission was in clear signal broad frequency, translated into 17 human languages simultaneously. It was a greeting. It was measured, respectful, and made no demands. Ren read it twice, then he drafted a response. The response was also measured, also respectful. It confirmed receipt and expressed willingness to enter formal dialogue. It was exactly the response a senior military strategist would construct when the correct outcome was conversation rather than confrontation. At the end of it, in the final paragraph, almost as an afterthought, Wren added 4 sentences that were not in any prepared protocol. He wrote, "We have known something was up there for 19 days. We have been ready for 19 days. We are choosing not to respond to your presence with hostility because you have not been hostile. We hope that continues to be the right choice." Rail read those 4 sentences on the transmission screen in the scout ship. He sat with them for a long time. Then he opened his log and wrote the last entry he would write from Earth orbit. He wrote that of all the species the Veyron collective had ever encountered, the humans were the only ones who had built their entire civilization on the assumption that they might someday need to defend it. That assumption had made them capable of extraordinary harm and extraordinary endurance in equal measure. It had also made them the only species he had ever met that understood, from direct experience rather than theory, what it actually cost to keep a peace. He wrote, "We have much to learn from them. I suspect they know that too." He closed the log. Outside the viewport, the planet turned in the dark, the same as it always had, patient and blue and full of people who had been waiting, without knowing it, for the rest of the universe to finally show up. They had been ready. They always were.